that was a turning the page moment for me where I was like, I'm going to keep fighting for another chapter to rewrite the ending of the story. I want to write it on my terms with more intentionality rather than this life of kind of not sure what I'm here for, living with more purpose and passion.
Welcome to Self-Funded with Spencer, sponsored by Pareto Health, ClaimDoc, and PlanSight. Whether we're discussing innovative new healthcare strategies, exposing hidden revenue streams or misaligned incentives, or even just cheering on the next generation of this industry, we promise you that you're going to learn something. So thank you for joining us for another great conversation about the future of healthcare. So I'm sitting down with Dylan Slattery, man. I really appreciate you coming in from Colorado, right? From the Denver area and joining me on the podcast, man. We've been trying to do this for a while now and schedule it, right?
Yeah, it's been going on for a little bit, but finally settled and grateful to be here.
Well, grateful to have you. And it's been cool to get to know you over the last year or two as well, man. And I think what I know today, hopefully, is going to be about is ultimately just your story. I don't even feel like we're necessarily going to highlight a healthcare solution per se. It's more about your journey and I would say you're almost accidentally finding yourself in the healthcare space for a very profound reason. And so, Dylan, I'd like to just start with you back in time a little bit. Kind of where'd you grow up, where'd you go to school, all that. And then, of course, where we want to pick up the story from there.
Yeah, absolutely. From Dyersville, Iowa, which, as I mentioned earlier, home of the Field of Dreams. So the movie came out on my birthday. And so I've been a huge baseball fan my entire life.
How old were you when it came out, though, out of curiosity?
I think it came out actually the year before I was born.
Okay.
But the date was April 21st.
All right. So Dyersville, Iowa?
Dyersville, Iowa. Field's still there. I've gotten to do a couple celebrity games out there as an umpire and meet some of the legends of the game, Johnny Bench, Reggie Jackson, Steve Carlton, Wade Boggs. Charlie Sheen, as I mentioned earlier,
cool
pretty crazy story there. But baseball's kind of been at the core. My mom's side of the family is massive, so I'm one of 41 grandkids. So family's always been at the core of everything that we've done. I'm the oldest of 4 boys, so I have 3 younger half brothers.
Okay.
And so we grew up. We were all Eagle Scouts. Loved the outdoors. Loved spending time on the water at our cabin. My mom's side of the family comes from a family farm that's been in our family for over 100 years. So
dude, that's awesome.
Kind of those Midwest humble roots,
I love that, man. I love that story. And honestly, I didn't know when you were sitting over coffee, you told me about the Field of Dreams being in your hometown. I didn't know where it was, but I was probably, I'm a little older than you, so I was probably like 8 or 9 when that movie came out. And I remember specifically, that was the first movie I ever noticed, like, feeling inspired. Like, I played baseball at the time. I loved baseball. And I was like, man, it made me want to go grab my mitt when I got home and start, practicing pitching. It was just like, oh, you can watch a movie. It was this weird thing of like, you can watch a movie and it makes you feel something and then you want to go out and do it. I was like, it was a profound moment for me as a kid.
Yeah, it's always been super special to me because my dad passed away a month before I was born. And so that scene at the end of the movie when it's, hey, Dad, want to have a catch? And you're a baseball guy.
Yeah.
It's like what you would give to have that moment when you've never had it is just something you can't.
I'll apologize in advance if I get emotional during this podcast, man. But so let's kind of catch up in your childhood. Where'd you go to school? Ultimately, college.
So I played JUCO baseball for a little bit.
Oh, you did? Okay. Did you get recruited then?
Yeah, I was a catcher, so played that for a little bit, and then ended up transitioning to a 4-year school that didn't have a baseball program. So it had gotten cut a few years prior. But so I played baseball in high school and then transitioned into college, did a little bit of coaching, ultimately coached there for 5 years at my high school alma mater. As I mentioned earlier, like my baseball coach is a legend in the state of Iowa. He coached at our high school for over 40 years, won almost 1,100 baseball games. And then ultimately our paths kind of crossed again where right after I became no evidence of disease with my cancer journey, he was diagnosed with glioblastoma and passed away 9 months later. So it's kind of interesting how all these things intertwine and are just really special to me.
Yeah. What was it? What was your coach's name?
Tom Jenk Jr. Yeah, he's
Tom Jenk Jr.
Yeah, he's in the Hall of Fame.
It's 1,100 wins as a high school baseball coach. That's awesome, man. Maybe we'll cut up a clip just so you can use that for memory for him. But it's awesome when coaches inspire us, man. And especially somebody with his track record of success. I'm sure he was a hometown hero, and probably everybody knew him in town and all that.
Field's named after him.
The field is named after him, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, just like special, and to stay committed and stay in high school, because some people will have success and they go, I want to go to college or I want to coach pros, but to just stay there in that pocket and be able to touch so many lives over 4 decades, that's just awesome, man.
Yeah, and for me, and I'm sure for you, like a lot of the coaches you've had growing up were father figures in different ways for you. And so for me, not growing up with my biological dad, a lot of the times the baseball coaches were the ones that I kind of looked to as that role.
That's awesome, man. Well, shout out to him. That's really cool.
Pareto Health is the largest benefits captive in the United States. With nearly 3,000 captive members, $1.3 billion of stop-loss premium in force, and almost 1 million covered lives, no other benefits captive comes close to Pareto Health's scale. But it's not just about the numbers. Pareto Health is a mission-driven organization, and that mission has 2 distinct parts. Number 1, to make self-insurance simple and more accessible for small to mid-sized employers. And number 2, to arm them with the most powerful cost management tools on the market. So if you're an employer frustrated with your healthcare outcomes, or you're a benefits consultant looking for an alternative to the status quo, it's time to consider Pareto Health. Pareto Health, where employers come to do self-insurance right, to do it easily, and to do it at scale.
So Dylan, why don't we, I think, pick it up where I believe like this conversation, the bulk of this conversation will start. And I'll let you give us the timeline and the background there. But when did we sort of enter this world of healthcare and get blindsided a little bit, man?
Yeah, so I was still in college when I was originally diagnosed with melanoma. So a lot of times people think of skin cancer. It's like, oh, just skin cancer, cut it out. Yeah. It's gone. Don't have to worry about it. But there's multiple different kinds of skin cancers, basal cell, things that are a little less serious. But when it comes to melanoma, which is what I was diagnosed with, it's one of the most aggressive forms of cancer once it penetrates through your skin. Okay. And so its typical track is there's 4 layers of your skin. The mole starts on the surface, penetrates downward. And then once it gets through the 4 layers of your skin, then it enters your lymphatic system, which is your body's filtration system. Okay. And so that's how it can take the pathways to the different organs. So typically the track that it takes is it'll go to your liver and your lungs, and then it will make its way to your brain. So like Jimmy Carter was a melanoma. He's had melanoma off and on over the last few years. And so he had it in his brain. We actually ended up doing the same treatment as what he did. And so mine ended up, first it started on my neck. So I have a 7-inch scar that runs from the top of my ear to the middle of my neck. Okay. That was from a mole that I had just on the right side of my neck. And we had it checked out by a primary care doc about a year and a half before things got more serious. At that point, they kind of just told me it was a mole. We'll keep an eye on it.
And how old were you at this time?
21.
And to you, when you had it checked out originally, was there anything that indicated to you that was more than just a mole and it should be at least checked out?
It was enough that it didn't exist my whole life. So it wasn't a mole that had been there my entire life or anything. So it was a little bit concerning that I didn't have a mole there. Then it appeared. Okay. But it was concerning enough that we wanted to have it looked at, but not concerning enough that the doctor seemed to be overly concerned at that point. Okay. Yeah.
So then after that, you had the surgery, they pulled it out. Did they test it at that time to see if it was cancerous or benign or what?
Yeah. So the reason that I had such the invasive surgery for just a small mole is that it was deep enough. That's how they measure the severity of a mole. And so it was right on the fringe of, do we do surgery? Do we not? And they wanted to be on the safe side. So they did the more invasive surgery, tested the margins to see if it had spread to the lymph nodes in the area. And at that point, it had not. And so they sewed me back up, told me I was good to go. I just looked like Frankenstein for a little bit. Yeah. Yeah.
And then, so then when did it come back, or when did it all of a sudden it became an issue, right? Because I presume at that point you thought, they got it, we're done, we're good, I'm going to go live my life, right?
Yeah. And they didn't really give me any sort of follow-up protocol as far as, hey, you need to be going to a dermatologist every 4 months, 6 months, none of that. I didn't have a PET or a CT scan in those 18 months before it came back. And so about a year and a half later, so the original surgery took place in April. The following September, October timeframe was when I woke up to go to a Iowa football game. I was out the night before with friends, maybe slept 6 hours or something, and just in that short period of time, I had developed this golf ball sized lump when I woke up. Oh, wow. To the extent that I couldn't open my mouth fully on the right side, and so I was slurring my words a bit when we went to tailgate that day, and so it was kind of like, what's going on? And I had a hunch at that point that it was probably not good. Okay. But for the day, you don't want to induce panic with family and friends around.
Understood, man. And so, but was it visible to others, or you just sort of felt it? Okay.
Yeah, you could see.
But it literally went from nothing really noticeable to overnight a golf ball size and being prominent. Okay. So once you had sort of gotten over, I don't want to say not thinking about it or not worrying about it, to I should probably go check this out. What did you do next? Did you go in the next day, or what happened?
So that was a Saturday morning, and we had immediately scheduled something up at Mayo Clinic for the next week.
Did you call somebody and tell them about it, or show them a picture of it, or how did they?
So I had already been up to Mayo Clinic for my surgery. So I was referred from the ENT in Iowa he had a relationship with somebody at Mayo. And so when I got the call at 22 for the mole on my neck, he called me on a Thursday or a Friday, and they had already scheduled the surgery at Mayo Clinic for the following week, Tuesday, Wednesday. Okay. So it was a pretty quick turnaround then. Having that connection, it was pretty easy to say, hey, there's something going on here. Yeah. We need to get you back in. And so I went up to Mayo Clinic, and they ran me through a ton of different tests. Probably the most painful was the liver biopsy, where they...
Ooh, what does that entail?
So... if you've ever seen the epidural needle.
Yeah. Yep.
It's 18 gauge or something. It looks like a pencil.
Yeah. My wife's had 2 epidurals. Yeah. I've seen it.
And so, I actually found out, that redheads apparently have a higher pain tolerance and, a lower susceptibility to pain medications. So when they were doing the liver biopsy, I get wheeled in on the gurney or whatever, and he has 3 needles visible on the table of different lengths.
Yeah.
And so he was like, okay, we're going to numb you all the way down. That's what the different lengths of the needles were. And then he proceeds to uncover this, looks like a sword, that he's about to shove into my side. And so that was probably by far the most painful thing, because he starts putting it, shoving it in, and I was like, I don't know what you just gave me, but I feel all of this. And so he rattled off something. I think they might have given me some sort of morphine or more serious painkiller. And so he starts again, and I'm like, I don't know if this is a joke, if there's cameras in the room, is this a prank? And because I can still feel it fully. I've been numbed up before, and I'm painful. Like, there's nothing going on here. And so he goes, okay, double it. And they start again, and he goes, are you good? And I go, I can feel it, but I don't care, because my head was in the clouds at that point.
Yeah, it's like, you can just get it over with. Okay.
Yeah.
So they did a biopsy of your liver and came back and said what?
There was multiple tumors in my liver. I had a tumor in my lung, multiple tumors in my spine and my neck. So at that point, it had metastasized to stage 4 melanoma, which the prognosis that they gave me was that I had a less than 10% chance of survival.
And this was at 23 years old.
23 years old.
That's insane. So I guess if you don't mind walking me through the psychology of hearing that news as a 23-year-old man.
Yeah, it's not something you ever imagine you're going to go through. And as the oldest of 4 boys, always kind of been the leader of the family and more social one. And I almost felt like I had to be the rock for my family, because they were panicking, what's going to happen? What if this, what if that? And I'm like, just kind of stay the course. We'll see what happens next. Take it step by step, and the path will unfold.
Okay. Yeah, but I mean, of course, obviously nobody likes statistics and people want to beat the odds. But I mean, hearing that, of course, is like, whoa, you probably don't expect it. And then does the fear follow to go, well, 10% chance? Like, is that even possible if I felt I was strong enough to beat it? I mean, like, did you kick into action or anything like that afterwards and start having a mentality of like, I'm going to overcome this, or what?
Well, at the same time as all of that was going on, I was pursuing 2 different degrees, one in education, one in economics. So I was either going to be a teacher and a coach or go into business was kind of my plan. And I was at a point where I was feeling kind of lost. Like I had gone down a path that didn't feel like it was mine. It wasn't genuine. And I felt like it was more for doing it for other people, or what the expectation of me was. And in between my 2 diagnoses, I had a pretty traumatic event happen where I was involved in a fatal car accident where I lost a high school classmate and friend of mine. So we were in a single vehicle rollover on a icy night in Iowa over Christmas break. And we ended up, the truck was laying on the driver's side. And so the back window was broken out. I rolled out of the back window, pulled her out from underneath the truck, and did CPR on her until she ended up passing away. And so that was pretty hard.
Dude, pretty hard. I mean, that probably doesn't even describe it.
Yeah, I wouldn't wish it on anybody.
Yeah, so that happened in between your 2 diagnoses as well.
Yeah, so about 18 months between the 2 diagnoses, and then the car accident was 9 months. So pretty much directly in the middle of those 2 events. And so from a mental standpoint, I was really starting to question things, not only my own path in life, but, she was such a joy. She was one of the bubbly people in our grade, and a distant relative of mine, actually. And, survivor's remorse is a real thing.
Yeah.
When you're like, why me?
Yeah.
Why did you take her instead of me? Like, I'm over here doubting what my purpose and path is in life. And she's over here, just super sweet, genuine. And, her life was cut short. And so you start to process all of those things, and you don't really know how to process it. And so for me, I had turned to things like drugs and alcohol, not to a crazy extent or anything, but it still is a masking mechanism.
Yeah.
And, you start to party, and you lose track of like what's important, and you get caught up in where are we going this weekend? What's the next thing? And you don't really give yourself time and space to feel the feelings. Yeah. And so for me, I had that going on mentally. And so looking back now, it didn't happen overnight, but cancer gave me something to fight for at a time when I felt like maybe life wasn't worth fighting for.
Interesting.
Which is very interesting considering, my dad took his own life. And so that was part of it too, was my mom was concerned that, the threat was real perhaps. And so she intervened and got me back on my feet. I was just getting back on my feet, coaching baseball, a sense of normalcy, sense of purpose. I love being out on the field, impacting young people's lives. And then that fall was when the cancer came back. So it was just this 18-month whirlwind of kind of gut punch after gut punch.
Yeah,
and
man.
So
just thinking about the psychology of that, because I'm 41 myself, going to be 42 in October. We're talking in August of 2024, and I'm aware of my mortality at this age. Unfortunately lost a friend and obviously an industry colleague in Marshall Allen recently to a heart attack, and I think he was 50 years old or so. He's so really, really young in the grand scheme of things. So I'm just thinking about if I were 23 at that time, I was playing college soccer. I was, just meeting my wife and those things. I can't imagine having that just getting hit over the head with the reality of life and mortality. And then, I could completely respect you going through this questioning of life and what's my purpose, and having an existential moment, because it's only natural to see a lot of loss around you like that. And again, it's such a tender young age. I mean, you are literally still a kid in my mind at 23 years old. So I'll ask you more questions around that later, but I want to close the loop as we get to your sort of treatment journey, the experimental treatment that you underwent as well that helped you. But so let's get to that point of, okay, cancer's back. It's metastasized. Remind me of the locations, a couple spots on your liver, one lung, you said it was elsewhere, lymph nodes.
Lymph nodes in my neck and then the spine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So at the reality of them giving you this 10% likelihood of survival, you're having to deal with that. Do you just immediately go and undergo treatment? Did you get a second opinion? What happened then?
Yeah. So the outlook was grim, to say the least. And then on top of that, kind of the way it was framed to me was, there's this experimental trial that's an option, but it's not looking good. And so I didn't feel a lot of confidence or conviction from the team that I was in front of at the time. And so we ended up getting a second opinion at the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics. It was closer to home than Mayo Clinic. And we had a lot of family and friends in that area that I could stay with, family and friends could stay with if they were coming to visit me and things of that nature. And so ended up going to the University of Iowa, and their outlook was completely different. So whereas at Mayo, it was, hey, we'll give this a try, but it's probably not going to work. They were, here's our best chance, and we're going to give it all we have. And that kind of, you could feel that all the way down from the oncologist to the nurses in the room.
Okay.
And so for me, that made a big difference. I started to really focus on mindset, energy, and kind of a burn the boats mentality of, if you don't believe that we can beat this, you're not my person right now in this season of life.
Well, that's interesting hearing you say that, because ultimately they confirmed the treatment protocol, right? It's not like they offered a new pathway of treatment for you. They just simply gave you confidence and suggested that not only is it possible, but we're going to help you do it.
Yeah.
Just that reframing slightly had to at least give you some hope.
PlanSight is a complete game changer in the world of insurance brokering. As a broker, you know how time-consuming and error-prone the traditional RFP process can be. But what if I told you there's a better way? PlanSight is the only end-to-end RFP solution on the market made specifically for benefits agencies. It's like having a superpower that gets you an average of 8 to 10 hours back per employer renewal per year. And the best part? PlanSight supports all carriers, all funding types, and all group sizes for over 20 different benefits. If you're ready to make your RFP process faster, more efficient, and more profitable, it's time to call PlanSight. Visit plansight.com now to book a free demo and discover the future of insurance renewals.
And so now let's go to that. So experimental drug, what was the drug?
So it was a 2-part trial. Okay. And it was a blind trial. So some people did one treatment first and the other second. And so I had the easier of the two treatments. It was ipilimumab is the name of it. And then that was before Christmas that year. And then after New Year's, I started high-dose interleukin-2, which is a very intense treatment. So I kind of got a false sense of what cancer treatment could be like. Okay. But at the same time, from a emotional or psychology standpoint, it was very strange because we had this grim outlook, and family and friends, were offering things of, hey, come do this. Could be our last chance. Could be our last Christmas. All of those things, which is just very strange at 23 years old. But at the same time, I understand it because people are just trying to do what they think will help. Mm-hmm. And so, it was an interesting point. And so when I started doing the high-dose interleukin-2, I had to spend 4 weeks in the ICU. So the treatment protocol was I'd spend a week in, a week out to recover, and then another week in, 3 weeks in between where they would do a scan to see if the experimental trial was working. And then another week in, week out, week in to finish.
Okay. So total time frame for that second round of treatment then was what?
Month and a half.
Month and a half. Okay. Yeah. And you said it was pretty intense though, right? The actual treatment itself was pretty intense. You're in the ICU, just braving. It's an immunotherapy, right? So was it come through intravenously or how does it work?
Yeah. So I had a port or a pick in my arm. I think it was a pick. Yeah. A pick in my arm. So they had multiple lines running in. And so, they were running multiple things in me to, hydrate, things of that nature. So I would do treatments every 8 hours over the course of 5 days for as many treatments as my body could take or hold up.
Okay. So got through it. I'm sure painful. I'm sure uncomfortable. I think you said you lost like 30 pounds, right?
Yeah, 30 pounds in like that month and a half because my appetite was completely gone. Foods tasted very strange.
Yeah.
I remember my stepdad brought a sub in, and we were in pods. So he was almost like 2 rooms across, and there was onions on the sub, and I just started vomiting immediately when he walked through the door.
Just the smell of it.
Just the smell. Yeah. So it was just weird things like that. And so they were measuring my output. And so I really focused on, my logical brain was like, well, if they're measuring output, I'm just going to drink as much water as I can. And hopefully that will give me the opportunity to do as many treatments as I could.
So the hope was that there was probably a range, right, of the number of treatments you could do within that time frame. I think you said it was like 15.
15 was the max.
And you wanted to get to 15 because I guess the presumption was more of the medication, the more likely it works, right? I think I would have the same mentality. And so did you get to all 15 or no?
No. So that was interesting. I came in the first week with no expectations really. And so they're like, well, how many do you want to do this week? And, school would tell us, why wouldn't you do them all?
Yeah.
So the plan was to do 15, and they're like, yeah, that's probably not realistic. So the first week they set the goal at 10, and I ended up doing 12.
Okay.
And then they measure, function of your liver, some of the other organs based on blood and urine and all of that. And so, so I would do blood work 6 hours, and then at 8 a.m. they would administer the first treatment. And it was pretty much like clockwork. After every round, about an hour and 15 minutes to an hour and 20 minutes after it was administered, my body would just start shaking uncontrollably, almost like a seizure or very deep shiver. And so they would put a heating blanket between my legs, heating pad between my legs, and Mummy tucked me with 8 blankets, and I was still just...
Were you actually physically cold though?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So is your body temperature dropping significantly as a result? You think was that
actually
what was
don't
going
know
on?
the answer to that.
Okay, but then you said it would flip, right? And then you get a fever afterwards.
Yeah, so that would go on for about an hour and 15 minutes to an hour and a half, and then just on a dime, my body... And this is an immune response because I was taking an immunotherapy, and so on a dime it would flip, and then I would have a fever of 104, 105 for the next 2 hours until we could get that under control. And then, 2 hours after that, I'm doing blood work for the next round.
Good grief, man.
Yeah.
And I think you were describing immunotherapy to me because I didn't quite understand the difference between that and chemotherapy and what's the other type of treatment?
Radiation.
Radiation, excuse me. So then immunotherapy, what would kind of summarize in layman's terms what that means?
Yeah, so in the simplest form, traditional chemo and radiation is an outside source that attacks the cancer and tries to destroy it. In the process, it often destroys other things around the cancer. And so people with radiation will have like burns, chemo, they'll have other side effects, whether it's affecting organs or body parts or rashes, all sorts of different things. Is
hair loss the one that's result of chemo predominantly?
Yeah,
okay.
Typically. And then, so immunotherapy is, the way the doctors described it to me is when you run like a system update or add a program to your computer, you have to download it and then reboot the computer. And it's basically downloading a program into your body that says, hey, this is cancer, we need to fight it, rather than your body in its current form is saying, let it grow, let it reproduce, and cancer is just a massive reproduction of cells that tries to take over. And so immunotherapy retrains your immune system to recognize cancer as cancer and then fights it on its own.
Is the argument that it's more precise, if you will, or because it's teaching the body that it's going to be more effective than the outside style treatments? I'm curious what is kind of the evolution, if you know, right? You may not always know these things, but the evolution towards immunotherapy is being maybe a more effective or better treatment.
They're getting very targeted. Okay. So I qualified, and they believe part of the reason why I responded so well to the treatment is that I had a BRAF mutation. I have no idea what that means, but I had it. And so the treatment that I was taking was targeted specific to that genetic mutation with the belief that with the more targeted therapy, it was more likely that it was going to work.
Okay.
But it's not true for all people. Not everybody has that mutation. And so even the 5-year survival rate on stage 4 melanoma today is still less than 15%.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Okay. Jeez. Okay. So you're here, right? So ultimately, there was some success. If not, I want to say complete success. I won't use those words, but tell me, like, now we've completed the treatment. Obviously, you need to come back and do scans and find out where we are. Did it go into remission? Did it shrink, et cetera? So finish that off for me.
Yeah. So in the process of treatment, there was a few things that I would say kind of coming to Jesus type moments where, again, you look death in the face. And at the time, I was, struggling mentally. And so it's like, here's your out. If you want it, are you going to give in, or are you going to double down and keep fighting? And so there was a few things that happened where I was in the ICU and we were in pods. So there was another person, and I have no idea what they were in there for or what their illness was. And she ended up passing away, and it was in the middle of the night. So I was awake in between treatments, kind of all to myself. Lights were off, and I could hear her family and friends kind of sharing the memories. They'd be laughing and crying, everything in between. And so it was a life-changing moment for me, because I got to thinking, like, what would my family and friends, and ultimately what would my 3 younger brothers say if I were to pass?
Yeah.
And so at that point, that was a turning the page moment for me, where I was like, I'm going to keep fighting for another chapter to rewrite the ending of the story. I want to write it on my terms and not with more intentionality, rather than this life of kind of not sure what I'm here for, living with more purpose and passion.
Well, you did tell me over coffee, I think, that did you have a near-death experience, or you thought maybe you woke up and they were about to shock you or something like that?
Yeah. So because of the immunotherapy, and again, it still takes you down to nothing, as they say, and then builds you back up. But in that process, I did wake up one night to 6 to 8 medical professionals rushing in, and they grabbed the paddles, and because I was nearing a flat line, because my organs and body was starting to shut down from the severity of the treatments. And so fortunately, I bounced off of it. They never had to shock me, but that was definitely a wake-up call.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Did you feel, did it feel like anything, or did you feel yourself slipping, or was it like almost like your eyes were closing in, or in a dream state, back and forth? Like, can you describe it at all?
I was very loopy, and it was just wearing me out, because there's, treatment after treatment after treatment. And so through that, it just takes it all out of you.
Yeah.
And I didn't have any out of body experience or anything like that, but it was a wake up call for sure.
Okay. And I'm glad you chose to fight, right? I'm glad, right, that if you had those 2 options laid out before you, that you didn't just sort of feel like, man, it's too much. I can give in, and maybe it feels more peaceful and letting go and all that. And I'm sure that's the decision some people make when they get to that point. But you chose to fight, which is awesome. So you were able eventually to get the trial over with, right? And to leave. And then what's the follow-up and all that stuff look like?
So it was, in Colorado, we climb mountains, and oftentimes there's false summits. You get to what you think is the top, and then you see that now the peak's still up there. It was just out of sight for the last segment. And so after the experimental trial, the doctors were like, we can't believe this. There's no sign of disease. And it went 2 days after they told me that, and we had shared the news with family and friends, and I had aspirations of moving out to Colorado already at that point in 2015. And so I was starting to make plans, and 2 days later, advanced pathology calls me and is like, hey, there's still 2 small tumors in your liver. And me kind of being that, like I said, living on the edge and not knowing what tomorrow is going to bring, I'm like, I'm going. So I moved out to Colorado in 2015. That only lasted 2 months, because the scan that I did out there showed that the tumors in my liver were already starting to grow and progress again.
Okay.
And so with some things up in the air around housing and jobs at that point, I decided to move back and continue my treatment regimen at the U of I.
Well, to be fair, though, obviously it was a false summit, right? And then you're going to give us what happened next. But progress was clearly made, right? Because the only place they detected the continuation of the tumor was in your liver.
Yes.
So the lung that was not detectable. I think you told me in your spine, there was a couple spots in your spine.
Yeah, all the spots in the spine had completely gone away.
Okay.
Yeah, so everything had regressed, but there was still some.
So that was just like you were just so close, dude.
So close.
Okay. So you get the news. We're gonna restart your life in Colorado. Decided the best bet is to come back because the tumors are growing. So then what?
Yeah, so through my baseball coach, made a call, got a job at a local bank in the 401k space. So I was doing educational meetings and helping members make changes. They also are governed by ERISA. I have a pretty funny ERISA story. So inside of my first 2 weeks, we were a pretty small shop. And so it was kind of, our service team was all hands on deck at any given point. And 1 week we had a guy out for doing member meetings on site. Another woman was out for maternity leave. And I think somebody called sick, and it was like my first or second week. I didn't know anything. And so an advisor called into the wrong number, reached the service number, and I'm talking to him, and he said something about ERISA, and I'm like, we don't have an ERISA who works here. And he goes, I don't think you're the guy I need to be talking to. Yeah. I said, okay, I'll get you over to sales.
Well, that was a funny story, because at first you were like, I got a funny ERISA story, which I don't think anybody's ever uttered that word, in existence, but that was pretty, I don't think ERISA works here.
Yeah.
It's freaking hilarious. Okay, so you go back, you get the job with your bank. This is your coach, I guess, you're the baseball coach that we talked about before. So you're working, but then now do you go through a follow-up to the trial? Do you go to a new drug? What do you do next?
Yeah, so by this point, through some of the trial that I was going through and some of the other immunotherapies that they were testing, there was an immunotherapy that came through FDA approval, and so I ended up getting put on Keytruda, which is another immunotherapy, and it was very similar to the first part of the trial that I did, where I had to go down every 3 weeks for infusions. And so fortunately, the bank was super flexible with me. I was able to make up hours inside the pay window and things of that nature. And they were super accommodating. And so I would go down first thing in the morning, because I found pretty quickly that the further later in the day your appointment is, the more things get pushed back. And so then you're there till 6, 7 p.m. So having friends and family that are in Iowa City going to college and things like that, I would go down the night before, stay overnight, do my labs 7 a.m. and then treatments in the morning. And so I was usually done around noon, and I would either go back to work if I was feeling up to it, or sometimes I would need to stay in Iowa City and take a nap.
So was this one as intense? It doesn't sound like it was as intense. Okay,
no.
Cool.
No, the only thing was the fatigue and some loose stool here and there, but yeah.
Okay. And so then you get to a point, right? It sounds like with this new drug, you go through again that treatment regimen. Now we're at a point where eventually we get to what you called no evidence of disease.
Yeah, NED is the acronym for no evidence of disease.
And I was telling you, that sounds like such a cold medical term, man. I mean, because no evidence of disease, you would think as a layperson, you might say, I'm cancer free, or my cancer's gone. But they will use probably legally no evidence of disease just to maybe not get a false hope, possibly. Because when you say that versus you're cancer free, there's always the potential, right, for some sort of return.
Yeah, well, and with melanoma, it comes and goes so frequently, or it can be not there one day and there the next or the next week. So that's where they use no evidence of disease, and it's people will be like, how many times have you had cancer? And it's like twice ish. Like how do you start one, and like, where do you draw the line of when I had it or I didn't have it? Because you don't always know.
And how long have you been in the position then ultimately with this, at least the category of no evidence of disease? And maybe even if you don't mind, tell me about the frequency of follow-up and checking and all those things, because I'm sure now they're on top of making sure it doesn't come back, right?
Yeah, so inside of the 5-year window, because that's typically how they measure survival rates with cancer, is what's the 5-year survival rate. And so inside of the first year, I had to do PET CT scans every quarter. That stretched out after 2 years to every 6 months, and then after 4 years to every year. And then in between that, twice a year to a dermatologist.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they're on top of it, obviously checking, and, knock on wood, of course, we haven't had issues since.
ClaimDoc is a medical claim auditing and member advocacy company. We provide fiduciary services to employer-sponsored benefit plans, and allowing them to create an environment where we ensure that the benefit plans are being charged in a fair and reasonable basis.
My business is basically people, and it become a real simple transition. We thought it was going to be far more complex. I've saved, we'll say, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I could not say enough about ClaimDoc.
But I want to ask you now, and I'll let you, obviously, if there's anything else you want to finish in that portion of the story, but this has certainly shaped you in an interesting way towards healthcare, right? Now you find yourself in it, but is there anything that we didn't cover, at least in terms of that portion of your life? I don't think it's never going to be just a portion of your life, right?
Yeah.
I think that's unfair to say, but did we miss any parts of it?
No, I mean, at that point, some of the questions that they ask you going through treatments, it's, do you plan on having children? Like, you have to discuss all of those different things, get a will in place. Like, I had my last rites given to me when I was really struggling with some of those near-death type experiences. And then once it ended, one of the other questions that they ask when you're in that experimental trial is like, do you want to share your results with like the group to release some of those performance type HIPAA records to contribute to the greater good? And so it started to shift my perspective, because once I had gone through that, there's other people going through things too. And so I would get people reaching out to me, and then I got asked to do a speech at Relay for Life. One thing led to another, and I'm being asked to speak at, more corporate or Chamber of Commerce type events. And so it was really a way for me to make my story not so much about me, but a way to give back to others who are struggling. Because again, it's not just about those who fit in the box of cancer or this or that. It's really, and that's when I had the idea of starting a podcast with the speaking of around the idea of adversity is a universal experience. And ultimately, it's not the what that we go through, but it's the feelings. The feelings are mutual. How it makes us feel, and ultimately what differentiates us is how we respond. And so if I could share the stories of others who had gone through other forms of adversity, I could really show that and portray that message, because often I would get feedback from people who would be like, I've gone through this really hard thing, but it's nothing compared to what you've gone through. And it's like, that's not fair.
Yeah.
What you've gone through those feelings are real too.
I think what Joe Rogan says it really well is the hardest thing that's ever happened to you is the hardest thing that's ever happened to you, right? So it's unfair to compare. It's not like we're comparing notes of who had the more harrowing, difficult journey.
Yeah.
But everybody has their own version of that they've experienced, and it doesn't negate their experience just because it wasn't as severe as yours. But is there anything that you learned about the healthcare system itself that you thought sucked or was broken or you wanted to fix? Because oftentimes I'll find folks that go through a personal health journey like that get the reality of what's really inherently wrong in the system, and then it motivates them to want to do something in healthcare. Did you have anything like that?
Yeah, lots of lessons, really. I think the biggest thing is, I was never reached out to by insurance or anything. Even when I had a denial around a scan around my 5-year mark, because once you hit the 5-year mark, then insurance generally doesn't want to pay for the more expensive tests and scan that I would like to have, because it's more thorough and gives you more certainty, but they don't always want to pay for that. And so really being an advocate and fighting for yourself, fortunately I was surrounded by family and friends who would fight for me when I couldn't fight for myself some days, nurses, oncologists, things like that. But I think there's a huge education gap around navigating the system.
Yeah.
And so something as simple as like, hey, I don't feel right in this environment where you're kind of treating me as a collection of body parts and a handful of tumors rather than a whole person. And so being able to stand up for yourself, cancer really gave me the power to say no. And so prior to that,
you told me there was a specific instance where you advocated for yourself and realized you had the power to do so. Was a nurse that wasn't very caring or something like that?
Yeah, and she could have just been having a rough day too. But, I was very in tune with the energy in the room, and this one night, it was a new nurse. I had never seen her before, but she came in and, kind of hunched shoulders, and it seemed like everything was just, like, I have to do this and I have to do this. And it just didn't, the energy just didn't fit in the room. And so I just asked for a different nurse. And so just being able to stand up for that, for the power of a second opinion, like, that's super powerful, because I never would have had the experience of another set of providers saying, hey, this is our best chance and we're going to give it everything we have. And for me, that made all the difference. The mindset of, kind of going back to my coach, it's like, when you walk on the field, you should expect to win. And so you want to surround your team you want to surround yourself with a team that expects to win too. And from a mindset perspective, I was reading things like, how to work on the mindset and the placebo effect. And so things that can't be measured are still real, and the power of the mind is incredible.
Absolutely. And I think your first job was actually in the first healthcare job was prescription drug space, right?
Yeah. So I worked.
How did that come to be? Yeah.
I was referred to Gary Becker and had a good talk with him. And he actually, in the interview process, watched one of my talks to the Iowa basketball team. And that's what put him over the edge to at least give me a chance, because he knew I didn't have any experience. And so what I told him was like, look, I'm coachable. I know how to build relationships and connect with people. I might not know all the terminology, but I can learn that. And so he took a chance on me, and I learned pretty quickly and learned a lot from him. And interestingly enough, I started going through the list of drugs that have patient assistance programs and some of the alternative sourcing, and Keytruda was on the list.
Oh, really?
And so it was like, this is a real powerful story of, I've been on this medication. I know how much it can cost. I know my worst year ever from a financial standpoint was like over 1.5 million. And so not everybody's fortunate enough to be on an insurance plan with a $1,500, $1,800 max out of pocket. Like, we were on with my mom's bank when I was going through all of that. And so financial stress is a real thing. Fortunately, we didn't have to worry about a lot of that component of it. But there's still stresses that are put on around logistics. I have 3 younger brothers that need to get to practice or school or this or that. Mom and dad still have to work. And so I think the education around how to navigate the system and really advocate for yourself, because you have a sense when things don't feel right, generally they're not. And so being able to stand up for yourself when you get those senses, rather than, oh yeah, that sounds good, it'll come back to haunt you.
Yeah, I was gonna say too, like, that's a perfect circumstance for why insurance exists in the first place, right? And I was having this conversation earlier today with somebody about the fact that health insurance has sort of been converted into like, it covers everything. We want it to cover everything. And in the same instance, your car insurance doesn't cover your gas or doesn't cover your tires, right? You don't want insurance for that. You want it for the unforeseen, unknown, large, catastrophic event that nobody might be able to predict. And therefore you buy insurance to protect you in that equation. And I think that's I wanted to at least call out, because I'm very critical of the whole healthcare space, not just the delivery side, but the financing side. That's an instance where it worked. And now somebody could come in and argue, well, that they overcharged for the medication or the way you sourced it or et cetera. Like, I'm sure there's all sorts of critiques that could happen there. The point is, it functioned in that circumstance as it was designed to do. And you guys don't have the financial burden that other people might have. So I at least want to say something positive about health insurance. It's rare that we do that on this show. But I'll ask you, man, now as you sort of, how old are you? Are you 30?
33 now.
I was going to say you're in your 30s, okay. As you move forward and think about what you want to do in this space, right? Like if you were to think of, I've used this, if you could treat the situation you had as a catalyst for good. The mentorship makes sense. Connecting with folks, the public speaking makes sense. But what about in the actual healthcare space itself? What would you like to see changed, or what do you hope to be able to effectuate here?
Yeah, I think over the last 5 years being in the industry, I've seen a lot of progress, and there's a lot of cohesion in different cohorts that are trying to, spread this message of advocacy and multi-tiered, plan designs and things where because I've seen very quickly when I was at the script sourcing, it's like, if you give a $0 copay, people are more likely to use that benefit.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of that comes down to communication and education. And I think the unique perspective that we're in as more service providers, where we're not brokers or consultants that are out meeting and running the meetings with those companies, we can be a huge source for, hey, what's the industry doing well? What's working for other brokers? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you would agree, but some of the best consultants that I've worked with and seen are the ones that communicate, because you can put the best plan in front of a company, but if they don't know how to use it,
absolutely,
it's a wash. Yeah. And having that as a member or a patient, having the certainty that when I'm going to use the plan, it's going to work how it was intended. The only way that can work is if they've been educated to know what are my options, who is my advocate, how do I find out what my options are.
What benefits do I have available, right? Even something as fundamental as that. But then you get into the world that you and I operate in too, is self-insurance, where you might have 10, 12, 15 vendors theoretically on your health plan that all do something slightly different. And so how do you get that into the member's hand at the point of need and help them navigate and understand what they have and use it? Because none of these solutions that are out there, as great as they are effective at all if nobody's aware of them or nobody knows how to use them. And I think that's what most point solutions struggle with.
I think that's a really good point, because an observation that I've had is some of the best that are doing it and doing it well operate under the belief that simpler tends to be better. And if you are taking somebody from, say, a fully insured plan where it just works, right? Mm-hmm. Or that's the perception. Perception is reality in a lot of these cases, and perception usually creates that education gap, because if they think their new plan is going to function and work and navigate the same way, that's a huge gap where you're going to set yourself up for failure as a benefit consultant, as HR.
Well, I think simpler is absolutely better. The ability to communicate. And I think one of my buddies will sit down with like his 9-year-old daughter and then try to explain something complex in healthcare. And he wants to be able to communicate it to her, who she has very little context of maybe even what her dad does. But his goal is to be able to try to communicate to her that concept. And until he can, he feels like he hasn't done a good enough job of simplifying the process. That's a really cool barometer which to test how good are you at communicating something complex.
Absolutely. Because on a plan, you have language barriers, perhaps,
yep.
Any different scenario of, is it a child? Is it, teen mom that's having to navigate the system, or anywhere in between, somebody who's been at the company for 30 years under the pre-existing plan and now they have to think differently. Like, there's all these sorts of scenarios where we have to meet people where they are. And I think it all starts with education and advocacy.
Obviously, I agree with you, or I wouldn't do a podcast educating about self-insurance every week and get on webinars and fly around the country. I do believe that the marketplace is just dramatically in need of a baseline understanding of our healthcare system. And the more people that do understand it, I think the better system that will come out of it, because people will demand something better. They just simply don't know that something better exists, or they're in a situation right now that they don't even understand the situation that's actually limiting them. So why would they demand something better? And I think that just comes down to education for sure.
Yeah, and I think as an industry, and your podcast is a perfect example, like we've done a really good job of closing that gap around the broker community. Now we just have to translate that a level further.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I think about that every day. How do I get to the college kid and tell them how cool this space is? Or how do you get to the employers that don't realize these things exist? How do you get to the mom or kitchen table so she's making better decisions about which plan to choose for her family? I think about those things all the time. In the interest of, kind of wrapping the loop or putting the bow on this podcast and finishing up, 2 real main questions for you left, Dylan. One, let's talk about, I asked you the impact you might want to have in the healthcare space or see change, but what do you envision? You said we're making progress in the 5 years or so you've been in it. What do you envision maybe the next 5 years looks like in healthcare, positive or negative?
Yeah, I think we've seen the inflation over the last year, 2 years, 3 years, and being able to think about how we can impact people, not just from a healthcare standpoint, but when we start to free up some of those dollars from a corporate standpoint, the impact that you can have as far as, making real change in people's life and starting to, because not having passion and purpose is a real thing. And so if people aren't excited about where they're working, it can be a real detriment to the culture and the team. And so I think solving this problem solves a lot of other problems.
Absolutely does.
And so if we can start here, the trickle-down effect, I think, of making the healthcare system more efficient, you always think about the unintended consequences of, the different things that have been passed and we didn't see this coming, or, the skyrocketing rates. Well, all of those were downstream effects from other decisions. So think about the compound effect. If we can start to bend that curve a little bit and get out of the negative consequences and into the positive, those things can start to add up and really make it.
Well, I would love if we can get to a point, and I'm thinking of a chart in my mind. I can visualize it right now because it was on a webinar recently, but I think it was over the last 10 or so years, family premium was up 55%, but deductibles themselves were up like 110% over that same period of time. So what that means is, in order to try to control costs, most employers are shifting more and more of the financial burden from plan design onto the employees, meaning they have to bear more of the expense of the actual consumption of care. So they're paying more for care over time in premiums, but they're doubly paying more for care over time and actually using their health care. I think we can get to a point where we, like you said, bend that curve, and then more employers can start looking at their health plan as an asset to recruit and retain, and then free up those dollars to deploy in their business, whether that's giving people raises or hiring new people, growing their business. Right now, it's being siphoned off of their bottom line, and it's going into this sea of inefficiency right now. I think if we can stop that, return it to their bottom line, business owners will have the ability to use those dollars for good for their own business and their own employees. And that's where I want to get, is to stop that bleeding and then turn it into something positive.
Yeah, because these people who are, going through whatever it is, multiple sclerosis, cancer, any of those chronic type illnesses that create pain or headaches or whatever it is, that's impacting how they show up. Yes. And so a lot of these, we just saw Emma Fox posted a story about I think a 5-year-old or something that was with her at a birthday party and was talking about how her mom was avoiding treatment altogether because she couldn't afford it. And so it's like, what's the impact if we were to reverse that? How would that child's mother be able to show up if she was pain-free? And so,
as a mother and as obviously an employee too, right? The productivity, sometimes we just get really kind of calculated. Oh, you're a more productive employee. Great, that is good. You also be just a better human for your family members as well. Yeah, because simply focusing on making it cheaper doesn't solve the problem. It has to be usable and functional. And so a lot of these current arrangements, like you said, with the super high deductibles, we've all heard the story. Most people don't have $500 to spend on an unexpected expense. And so if we expect them to fork out thousands of dollars to access the healthcare system, it's just not realistic. Yep. And so how are people showing up? Because they're choosing to forego the care that they need because of the price. Absolutely. Well, so why don't I do this, Dylan? I'll ask you sort of closing thoughts, man. We've covered a lot of ground, obviously. Again, I just can't thank you enough for coming down here, making the journey and telling your story. But if somebody's gotten to this point in the podcast and, you wanted to summarize either closing thoughts or just even a point that you wanted to leave in this with, what would you say? Yeah, I would say the most powerful moment in my entire journey, I was a sports guy growing up, and when I was younger, I wanted to be a broadcaster. And so when I was going through my cancer journey, it was the same year that Stuart Scott, who just so happened to be my favorite guy on SportsCenter growing up, gave his ESPY award speech, and it changed my life. Really? Okay. Yeah. So in that speech, he said, when you die, you don't lose to cancer. You beat cancer by how you live, why you live, and the manner in which you live. Mm. And for me, that shifted the perspective entirely. I no longer feared death. It was a win-win scenario where how I was showing up every day defined the outcome.